Well, thanks, Scott. And I also want to acknowledge Scott because this idea was his to begin with. He happened to be putting this together when I showed up in Detroit in March of this last year to start the Science Gallery Lab. So thank you all for coming. This is a super exciting moment for me because this is actually our first official Science Gallery Lab event. So for us, we're making history, and that each of you is here is really exciting for me, so thank you very much. So as Scott said, the purpose of these talks is to explore the intersections of art and science. And one of the things that I like to say is I steal from Frank Oppenheimer, who is the founder of the Exploratorium in San Francisco, my favorite science museum, and I think the most important science innovation and informal science learning maybe ever. But since that opened in 1969, I have been a huge fan of the Science Gallery's work because it's provocative and unusual, and so I've been kind of a fanboy of their work for many years. But one of the things that Frank liked to say is that scientists and artists are the same. They're the official noticers of our society. They are the ones who help us to see things in the world that we might never have noticed without their help. And it's also amazing how similar their practices are and their processes. And you'll hear that tonight, I think, as Sam and Beronda go through reflecting on some of their work. So I want to take just a minute to tell you what Science Gallery is. Has anybody in the audience heard of Science Gallery before tonight? Okay, fantastic. It started in Dublin, Ireland, almost 10 years ago. And the idea was, it started at Trinity College, Dublin, and the idea was to create a more permeable membrane between the academy and the community. And so there's a brilliant guy called Michael John Gorman who had this notion to connect people to science through art and art through science, and to do it in provocative and innovative and unusual ways. The gallery selects a broad theme, and it could be anything from love to artificial intelligence. And in our case, we've just released our first open call for work for a summer show that we'll do in this upcoming summer of 2018. And our theme is going to be hustle, which is a particularly Detroit kind of idea. And it's going to explore how, what does it mean to work hard or get worked over, and all the things that might mean. In particular, we're interested in attracting and reaching 15 to 25-year-olds. The gallery space is for everyone, but we believe that particular audience, the 15 to 25-year-old audience, has the creative potential to really change the world and solve the world's problems. And so we want to engage with them around big ideas that are going to change the world and give them these objects of inquiry that get created, proposed, and then created by artists, scientists, makers from around the world that explore this theme and allow for discussions to happen in the gallery space that are supported by mediators. These are also young people, usually college age, who've had an opportunity to interact with the scientists and artists and people who have created the work for the show. When you come into the gallery, it's much more like participatory theater than it is like a traditional science museum experience or a science museum, for that matter. So there is great, the way I like to say it is when the gallery's working really well, it's like being with some of your best friends around a table, sharing a meal and a bottle of wine and talking about things that get you on the edge of your seat and excited. It feels great. So the gallery was so successful in Dublin that it, after a short period of time, was attracting more than 400,000 people a year to their shows, which in a country of 4.5 million is a lot of people. And so King's College in London saw what was happening in Dublin and said, we would like a gallery too. And then the University of Melbourne in Australia, same thing. Shortly, there will be galleries coming online in Bangalore, India, as well as Venice, Italy. And I was approached by the CEO of Science Gallery International because we've been dear friends for almost a decade. And he asked me to consider starting the first gallery in the United States. Well, I knew pretty much immediately who I wanted to take this idea to, and that was another friend who will be here shortly, Jeff Grable, who is Michigan State's Associate Provost for Teaching, Learning, and Technology. And he loved the idea, and he took it to Michigan State's Provost, and she loved the idea, and she took it to the president of the university, and she loved the idea as well. So I also owe a debt of gratitude to these two, I think, amazing women who are providing great leadership at Michigan State, leading us to become a new kind of university in the 21st century. So with that said, I'll wrap up this part and just say, if you have more questions about the gallery, please come see me, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it after the show, or give you my card, and we can correspond by email or on a phone call. But now, for tonight's program, I'm incredibly excited to be on, well, not on a stage, but here in front of you with two really amazing people, Sam Van Aken, who is a professor at the University of Syracuse, and my friend Beronda Montgomery, who is a foundation professor at Michigan State, which is a big deal. It's a big deal, but well-deserved. Beronda's work is incredible. So my first question to get us rolling here is, I find it really interesting that somehow you both found your way to plants as the thing. You went there to help answer important scientific questions. Sam, you went there to answer some important artistic questions. One of the works that Sam's most famous for is his tree of 40 fruit, in which he has grafted together 40 different trees, and this one organism produces 40 different stone fruit, which is an incredible idea. And Beronda's work is incredible too. I'm going to let her describe it to you because she'll do it much better than I was able to describe Sam's. But the question is, tell us more about how you arrived at plants as your medium and what interests you about them, and give the audience a sense of what you've discovered about plants and yourself through your work. Beronda, please.
Never shy to take a mic. So very generally what my life has been centered around with plants is understanding how these organisms that cannot move have to be exquisitely sensitive to what's going on around them and tuning their behavior and their metabolism to survive in those conditions. And so, at this time of year, I'm thinking about getting out of Michigan, but the trees can't go with me. And so how are they sensing that winter is coming and preparing? And so we have spent the last 15 years, almost 15 years at Michigan State, understanding how these organisms know what's going on around them, use that information to match their growth and behaviors to continue to persist. And so we study this on a very deep level, but I also spend a lot of time doing what my 15-year-old son says is very strange. So I spend a lot of time learning about plants, but I equally spend time thinking about what I have learned from plants. And so every about 3 months or so, I go on a retreat and think about, okay, we've been talking about what we've learned about plants. What have I learned from plants about being? And one of the things that I've learned is that you can be in any environment and still make it work. And not just make it work in terms of responding to the environment, but plants also do something. We as humans often notice how they're responding to what's going on around them, but plants also transform the environment. Plants are able to make the environment better for themselves. And that part has fascinated me forever in terms of how they not only respond to what's going on around them, but transform the environment to improve their lives. And so I have learned as much from plants as I have about plants. And I spend a lot of time talking about both of those.
Yeah, wow. Every time I hear her say it, I'm like, I want to hear more. One detail that I love that you said when Sam and I spoke with you is you talked about how plants can actually change the nature of the soil, for example,
So that's actually how I got interested in plants. I went off to graduate school to be a biologist and to be a science professor, and took a plant physiology class, not expecting to enjoy it, but it was the only one that would fit in my schedule. And at the end of that class, I was fascinated because I had always imagined plants were kind of just sitting there. But plants are doing some fascinating things. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is this ability to transform the environment. So we often use this phrase, bloom where you're planted, make the best of the environment that you're in. But plants don't just do that. They're able to change it. And so plants that are in a soil that don't have enough nutrients, that don't have enough, for example, iron or enough nitrogen, can actually excrete chemicals to make it more available. They can enter into relationship with bacteria so that the bacteria will do the work of making the nutrients more available. And so what they actually do is transform the environment to make it capable of them to exist more. And that inspires me, and I use that message a lot in mentoring. How do we get people to understand that you may be in an environment that feels like you can't really produce in the ways that you want, but you can transform that environment by interacting with it, by functioning in community, seeing yourself as more than just sitting there, but actually being able to make it a better place, even if you're not able to move to another environment.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. So Sam, how about you?
Yeah, well, I guess I started working with plants mostly through the process of grafting. So that was the first thing that sort of captivated me. And then as that sort of developed, one of the things that I started to realize in working with plants is that it's a work that continuously evolves. And that's something that I always sort of aspire to in my work, this idea of an artwork that I can go back to, and it's something different, right? That I'll be able to continue to look at, and it changes for me. And so obviously with working with trees, with working with plants, that evolution is kind of built into it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's cool. So you're both really interested in transformation and adaptation. How do you see those concepts as a scientist and as an artist? We'll start with you, Sam.
Yeah, well, Beronda, when she talks about, at least for me, where art and science start to meet are, with science, Beronda told me about plants changing their environment chemically, and I think that was about 2 months ago now, and I am still just trying to wrap my head around it, and I'm inspired by that idea. And so for me, science, beyond its sort of practical application, the really interesting part is that it expands your thought, right? Ideas unfold out of scientific discovery, which I think is a great thing when art does that too, right?
Yeah.
That you have these ideas that unfold, and it increases your sense of awe, and that's a pretty wonderful thing.
How did you get the idea for the tree of 40 fruit?
It came, God, this is weird. So it actually came from, I was doing radio hoaxes, and there's not much longevity in that in terms of an artwork. The FCC kind of shuts that down really quick. So
You mean like War of the Worlds kind of deal?
Oh, yeah, it was very much like War of the Worlds. And in fact, I got the tower, so in Grover's Mills, New Jersey, during the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast, it was supposedly where the aliens had landed. And I was driving by there on my way to New York, and I was like, oh, there's actually a town named Grover's Mills. And I stopped in and found out that on the night of the broadcast, the citizens of Grover's Mills went out, and they went searching for the aliens with guns. And they mistook a water tower that was in the back of Mr. Grover's house for the alien ship as it was described, and they shot holes in it. So the current owner wanted to get rid of it because there were lawsuits involved. And so I actually got that tower and used it as a radio broadcast antenna to do radio hoaxes in Buffalo, and then it sort of got shut down. But so I found out the idea of, so I really was interested in the idea of a hoax, and so researching it, I found out that hoax comes from hocus pocus, which in turn comes from a line in the Catholic Eucharist where the priest says, "Hoc est enim corpus meum," and it's where he transforms the bread into the body of Christ, and it's transubstantiation. And so it's where the reality of a thing changes while its appearance remains the same. And so that led me to think of what sort of ubiquitous thing could I work on that would do that. And so, I knew about grafting, and it was just sort of several ideas coming together that initiated the project. And since then, it's gone into other iterations, but yeah.
Right. That's a fascinating story. Sorry, I lost my questions here. This is the problem with technology. So the, sorry, y'all. So along that lines, transformation, both of your work has led you either from the laboratory, in your case, to the community, or the art studio to the community. Talk a little more about your evolution as a scientist and an artist, and about how your work led you to the kind of community work that you do now.
So I do a lot of, can I just say, that was amazing. We've had so much fun talking and listening to each other. My work in the community has really been around helping people understand the power of communities of support, whether that's mentoring or working with youth. And I was led from the lab into that by really reflecting on human nature and human relationships with plants, and the power for getting people to think about the relationship that humans have with plants, to think about community support. So one of the stories I often tell is that we as humans have an amazing capacity to be very empathetic with plants, most of us. So all of us, if we've had a plant in our home and it's not growing well, the first thing we ask ourselves is, what does it need? Does it need more water? And if it needs water, we give it tap water. And if that doesn't work, we try bottled water. And then we say, well, maybe it needs fertilizer. Maybe it's too close to the window, maybe it's hot, maybe it's cold. If all of those things don't work, our response is that we're not a good caretaker of the plant. And so I'm going to ask someone who's a better caretaker to give me some advice. And we'll then do that. We'll ask hundreds of questions, most of them, if we think about it, about the environment. What in the environment does the plant need? What kind of care does it need? And the very last thing we'll say is that this plant is incapable of growth, and I'm going to get rid of it. And so when I walk into communities, I do a lot of work with communities, underrepresented students or faculty. Often if those students aren't performing well in class, if there are students in the neighborhood who are struggling, one of our first responses is that there's a deficit in the person. And how do we fix the person? So I try to get people to think about their relationship with plants, their relationship with their pets. I have a sister who spent thousands of dollars on her puppy, and I think it's time to let the puppy go, but she says, no, we're going to keep working on it. So how do we get this relationship that we have with plants and pets to get us to think better and to do better and think higher of individuals who are struggling in our environments? And not first to ask, does this person have a deficit, but is there anything in the environment that can be done? Am I not a good caretaker of this person? Do I need help on my caretaking? If I can't take care of them, can I hand them to someone else? We'll give our plants to someone else. And so my work thinking about our relationship with plants and how the environment impacts so much how two equally capable plants grow has been a very good inroads to get people to think about building communities of support instead of communities of judgment.
Yeah, that was one of the first things she told me when we met, when I first got to Michigan State, and I was like, I've never heard a scientist before talk about the way in which their scientific practice had evolved their human practice and the way they think about connecting with other human beings. So you blew my mind then, and you do every time I hear you say it, which is great. So much fun. And also, just a quick plug for Beronda too. If you want more of this wisdom, you can find her on Twitter. She's a great follow. I love her anyway. Sam, can you talk about your progression from the studio to community? And you know, you've told me some about how even your connection to trees has expanded from the one project to many. And
Yeah.
I'd love to hear how it's that practice has evolved and the ways in which community are now central to your practice.
Yeah, a lot of it came from, so through the Tree of 40 Fruit, when I first went out to try to find 40 different varieties of stone fruit, I couldn't find them. And that's it. I'm in New York State, which has a pretty long fruit growing history. And I eventually found what was the last orchard of heirloom plum and apricot trees, and the problem was they were going to tear it out. So I sort of patched together art money to preserve the orchard. And then I grafted them all onto my trees to keep them. And then as I grew the trees, I got into community through eating fruit. I guess that would be the sort of analogy, but I would start to taste the fruit from the trees, and it was unlike anything that I had tasted before or that you could find, even at farmers markets. Like, this was at a different level. So I sort of just felt compelled that people need to know about this. And plus, it was also the distance from agriculture. I mean, I grew up on a farm, but I went to art school when I was 18. I was like, I don't want to farm anymore. But as I would, as you get out in the world, I think the numbers are kind of staggering. Like, after World War II, 50% of our population had some tie to agriculture. Now that number is less than 3%, somewhere between 2 to 3%. So, I was doing talks and meeting with school groups, and I was seeing kids that they never planted a seed and watched it grow, all right? So, after amassing all these different fruit varieties, I found out that people don't even have access to them. So that sort of evolved into creating my own gene bank. So I'm in the process of creating my own gene bank. Fruit trees need to be preserved through living material. You can't store them as tissue culture. And then opening that up to people to have workshops and to do demos. And I go to a lot of schools these days, which is pretty interesting. But that's a really receptive audience when you talk about grafting. They're like 8-year-olds get it. So yeah.
Huh, that's fascinating. And and I want to observe too that if you didn't know, you came in after the introduction, it would be hard to tell who is the scientist and who is the artist, because he's creating a gene bank, right? And you're doing activism in your communities, and I think that's awesome. I mean, that's what we're looking for. I think it's also you two as individuals also share many qualities, and I think one of them that I want to explore just a little bit is one that seems fundamental to both of your practices is curiosity and reflection. The anecdotes that you're telling are things that I don't think a lot of other people would have noticed, but you did. Talk a little bit about the role that curiosity plays in your life, played in your life as a child, where you are with it today.
Oh, wow. Do you want to take that one first?
Well, I'm smiling because anyone who knows me knows that if I have one question, I have 100. And so often when I'm talking to people, I think the first conversation we had, I asked 10 questions and I said, we're supposed to be having a bilateral conversation. And so I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and I think my parents had given up by the time I came along. And so my mother just, every why question I asked, she answered. She took me to the library twice a week so the librarians could answer my questions while she had a break. And so when I was starting to think about what I wanted to do, often people who've done the kind of work I do can work in industry where they do applied science, or you can work in academia. And for me, applied science, even though I hope my work will have applications, the only place for me was academia, because the thing you can do there is ask any question you want, as long as you can convince someone to give you some money to pay your students. And so that every day when I come out of my office, my students scatter because they know the first one I catch is I'm going to have them. And what did you learn yesterday? What are you doing tomorrow? How's it going? And so I think curiosity is something that is intrinsic to my nature. And I can't imagine a life without being able to ask where you are, why you're there, and what you can do by being in that space.
Love it. How about you, Sam?
I think the more I think about it, the more I think in terms of my artist practices, just sort of how, what, why, and constantly asking those questions over and over. So if, one thing always starts to evolve into something else, and I think it evolves out of that curiosity and questioning.
Yeah.
For it. And I think it was also, I like to blame my parents for a lot too, so that was like a big thing, Well, so my father had this, when I was a kid, he felt that the schools weren't doing enough, so he had assigned reading. So every week I would have to give a book report on Friday. The problem was he was a science fiction buff, so he thought it was really cute when in 1984 I was 12 years old and he made me read 1984, and I grew up like a paranoid kid. I was like always like, I've been looking for the cameras for ages, It's like
they're here now.
Yeah, and you're like, well, then I saw like Blade Runner recently, and I was like, I was 10 years old when he took me to see that. That's inappropriate. So I think there's a lot of that is in there too. Yeah.
Well, and I love that too because he was a farmer.
Yeah.
But that was his thing.
Yeah, there's like a lot. It was like the hippie farmer thing with science fiction. It was a moment.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I've done it again. So I'm curious to ask you to talk about one or more of the most gratifying things that your work has enabled you to experience. And I'll start with you again.
So about 10 years ago, because the president of the National University in Uganda got his PhD at the same place that I had gotten my PhD, they were deciding to have some community gardens installed for grandmothers who were raising kids who had been orphaned due to HIV and AIDS. And he called me and asked me if I would come and help design and plant community gardens. Now, I have no gardening experience, but he thought plant biology. And so I said, absolutely, I can do this. And I had the most amazing experience learning about the relationship. So I have relationships with plants. Plants are my neighbors and they're teachers. I learned so much from those grandmothers about the relationships they had with plants and how they had been integrated into their lives. And so that was one experience. But as I travel, my work takes me around the world, I am often asking about local cultures' relationships with plants, whether it's medicinal, whether it's whatever it is. And so the travel I've had and understanding how different people around the world imagine themselves or not in relationship with plants has been it has transformed my life in ways I can't even explain.
Would you tell us one of those stories about, a local, something that somebody's told you about a particular community's relationship with plants?
So one of those very small villages in the mountains of Uganda, where until recently they just got their first cell phone line, so they've really been isolated. There is a plant there that they use for a particular medicinal purpose. And they have been convinced for years that this plant has these medicinal properties. It relieves them. They've cultivated it. It has a sacred place in the community. And very recently, biochemists have identified a compound in that really does have some part in this. But the part of it that really impacted me was not just that they use the plant, but because of the impact of the plant on them, it has a sacred place in community. And so as children, people learn about the sacredness of this plant, the place in this plant, the ground that it's on is sacred. And they also think of the plant not just as a healer, but a teacher. And so I talk a lot about plants as teachers on Twitter and elsewhere. Yeah. And people have often said to me, so you think that plants are teachers? I said, no, plants are teachers. And if you don't believe it, you're a poor student. And so they really don't just think of this plant as a healer, but they think of the plant as a teacher. And so that has really transformed the way that I listen to plants, the way that I am in community with plants. Jeff is going to go back and tell the provost that I'm absolutely crazy, but that's okay.
Yeah, your secret is safe with us.
Well, it's on Twitter, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
it's okay.
It's out there. Well, I have to say that since I have heard you talk about plants, I look at them very differently than I did
I can retire now.
before we met. I don't know. I think you've got some more evangelizing to do. So how about you, Sam? Tell us about some of the more gratifying things that have happened to you through your art practice.
A couple weeks ago, I opened an exhibition, and there was a school group that wanted to come afterwards, and so I did. It was like 75 kids all at once, which was just, and they were all like 9 or 10. It was a little bit overwhelming, but at the end of it, this one kid comes up to me, he goes, "You're all right," and he handed me this origami thing that it was just sort of this sphere, and I'm like, wow, that's amazing, and I was like, I don't know if I need more validation than that, right? Him, like, that's a hard audience.
It is, yeah.
But I guess, I think it's sort of the interesting places that it takes you. And I think similar to what you're saying is that I'm very interested in the culture that gets embedded into plants. And so, I don't know, this is really weird, but I read 18th and 19th century agricultural reports just to find out, because for that gene bank, I have to find out the history of all these different fruit varieties. And in one of them, it's the peaches of New York, I came across this anecdote where they talked about collecting peach wands during an eclipse. So apparently...
Peach wands?
Yeah, so you take a section of that year's growth, and what you have to do is you have to soak it in salt water until the next new moon, and then you suspend them over the door. And I was like, oh yeah, this seems like we should do it. And so during the eclipse, I talked to a friend of mine in Oregon, and he was like, okay, yeah, I'll go collect peach wands for you. And just sort of working through that whole process, I worked with my graduate students from China to research the whole thing, and sort of at the end, everybody, at least we got something out of it. They ward off evil spirits, so it seemed like a good project to work on.
Amazing. What's been the biggest surprise for you on your journey, and how has the journey been different than what you imagined when you started?
That's a good question.
Well, I can say I had delusions of grandeur when I
We all do.
when I started my position. I just knew I was going to make these amazing, splashy contributions and publish big papers and get big grants and all of that. And we've done some things. But the thing that has impacted me so much is how much I have been impacted by the work that I do, by the students I've had an opportunity to be relationship in, by the people now bring me stories. The latest thing I've been doing is reading about indigenous agriculture, because people say, you might really be interested in this. Was telling Sam, a friend of mine sent me an album that Stevie Wonder did in the 70s about the secret life of plants. And so what my work has done to me will far exceed anything that we can produce from the lab. And we will continue to try to make contributions because I believe in reciprocity. And so I believe for all that I've been given in terms of transforming my life and my ability to contribute to community, I have to continue to produce. But I thought the production would be the gift, not the transformation of my life.
Great answer. How about you,
God,
Sam?
I have to follow that?
Yeah, I'm
That
sorry.
was amazing.
I'm sorry.
All right. Yeah, I think it's, the thing for me is, I didn't expect to now have like a few hundred trees, right? The other thing is being the plum guy. So it's like weird, like fruit growing is like this subculture in the way music used to be. So people are always looking for these rare varieties, and they always email me. They're like, hey, do you have such and such? But it's sort of getting into those things that you didn't anticipate, which I think is the real blessing. And that's kind of the magic of being at a university, right? And being at a place where it encourages that to follow those intellectual curiosities and fascinations. And that's been the part that it does feed you. That's the thing. Yeah, staying intellectually engaged like that is probably the most surprising and rewarding.
So you didn't imagine that that was what you would get in that environment?
No. Well, I think like moving beyond what is typically defined as art, right? I mean, the Tree of 40 Fruit just started because I was working on that in my backyard. I was like, yeah, let's see where this goes. And then, but I didn't anticipate it as an artwork or public artwork at the time. It was just sort of something that was curious. And then, yeah, it just sort of evolves out of that. Like that becomes your fascination. And fortunately, I'm in an environment that, allows me and encourages me to do it.
Very cool. So Winston Churchill said that success is going from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm. So iteration, what some might call failure, is at the heart of artistic and scientific practice. Talk a little bit about your own relationship with quote-unquote failure and how you deal with it when things are just not turning out the way you'd hoped over and over again.
There's I have a colleague at Syracuse who, this is probably about 5 or 6 years ago, was telling me about his research, and he's like, for 25 years he worked on this laser beam in the middle of Louisiana, right? And they were like, oh, if it vibrates, we know if a black hole is collapsed, right? And, I was like, really? And he's like, so it's just he would go out and watch the laser, right? Because if the laser bent, then they knew there was gravitational interruption. And, and then last year, of course, gravitational waves hit, the laser goes off. They're all like Nobel Prize level winners. Yeah. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. But like, sort of that commitment, that's what I admire in people. Like that to me is really an admirable thing. And in terms of failure, today was probably a good example of that. We were supposed to do the first launch with this new method of cloud seeding that we're working on. And we got to the last minute, and the material we were going to use to do the cloud seeding wasn't working with the mechanics, and it's like, you just come back at it. Yeah.
Let's just take a minute too, Sam, if you would, to describe the project of punching a hole in the sky, because you're going to come back in a few weeks' time, and there'll be a public moment where Sam is going to do one of his works. And if you could explain to us sort of what the idea is, and you're all welcome to come back and be a part of it.
All goes back to plants. One of the things with growing trees that I started to notice, and particularly with climate change, now we're getting weeks where in February of 80-degree weather in Syracuse, which is like, that's just crazy. And so, I was really thinking, and you have this desire, it's sort of this inherent desire of, I want to change the weather, right? And so I was talking about this, and my mother brought up this story. My grandfather, we weren't very wealthy farmers, and he was an atheist. And but my mother told me this one year where all the family's money was in the crops in the field, and we were in the middle of a drought. And she walked by his bedroom, and he was like kneeling down by the bed, like crying and praying. And just to get a little bit of rain so that we didn't lose everything. And, so I started to look into these actual and metaphorical ways that we attempt to change the weather, whether that's something as simple as prayer or it becomes actual attempts to do it. And then just sort of out of that evolved this project. I noticed this phenomena called punch hole clouds, right? So, it was on the internet. People were seeing these holes, perfect holes cut into clouds. And of course, on the internet, everybody's like, oh, it's UFOs. And I kind of doubted that. I was like, it's probably not. So I kind of created this, my speculation was that it was planes that were flying through these clouds, and through the pressure created off the wing foil, it was causing the water droplets to nucleate. So the project started with, I actually got a pilot and would fly up into clouds and just sort of put that hole in the cloud. But with that, you have to plan it. There's like so many days of planning that go into that, and I need a way that's more, that I could do it more readily. So we developed this way to do it with a high-altitude balloon. So the balloon lifts a payload full of, our next test is going to be to do it with sea salt into the cloud. As soon as it reaches cloud height, it releases the salt and creates a cloud within a cloud that nucleates it and creates that perfect hole. And now the goal is to actually have sunlight come through. It's called corpuscular rays, Buddhist fingers, Jacob's ladder, but to have that light that you see in Renaissance paintings. So, yeah, we'll be back, I think, mid-December.
And
back at it.
So instead of a plane now, he's going to use a weather balloon.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's coming up. Watch for Science Gallery Lab feeds, and MOCAD as well. We'll be publicizing that.
All right. I forgot to plug that.
Yeah. So about 5 more minutes, Scott, you think? We're at 7 o'clock? Yeah, okay, cool. So so how do you envision the evolution of your practice? What are the scientific or artistic questions that you want to be working on in the future?
So this is interesting because I have a problem getting emotionally attached to everything I work on. So in my lab right now, we have a project I started as a PhD student. We have one I started as my postdoctoral studies, one I started in my sabbatical. And so what I've been doing of late is trying to ask the students and postdocs who work with me what they're interested in. And so right now, our newest projects are projects that they were interested in pursuing. And I was able to help support them in doing that. And so my science will take me where the students want to go, as long as I'm able to get money.
Yeah, I like that answer. That's good. Yeah, there's Richard Hemming, I think, said, he has a quote that I love that was that it's unlikely you'll do important work if you're not working on important questions, which I love. How about you? Where do you see your work evolving to, knowing that it will, as we explored earlier, not be what you imagine? What do you imagine, though?
I've been telling Scott all week, I'm like, if we put this hole in the cloud and we get those, like, the light coming down, I'm retiring. I was like, I'm walking away, and I'm going to get, like, a hobby like golf or something like that. Like, yeah. I'm like, that's it. Like, I can end on that note.
I did it.
Sort of what fascinates me, one of the things right now is that in the process with the trees, with working with the weather, came across this quote by the philosopher David Hume, where he talks about a miracle as a transgression of the laws of nature. And that sort of stuck with me, right? And this idea of, how can you make that thing, like I talked about earlier, like you telling me that plants change their environment, that thing that creates awe. I think that's worth aspiring to anyway.
Yeah, great. So I see we have some young people in the audience too, and for all of us really. But I'm curious what what advice you might have or messages you might have for people in our audience who might want to consider becoming an artist or a scientist?
My advice to young people is to spend time really understanding what makes you excited, and don't let anyone talk you out of doing it. The entire approach I've taken to my career, I've been redirected. You should go down this way. And I said, no, I see my path over there. And I think having an idea of what keeps you motivated, what gets you excited, even if it's something that no one else can envision or imagine, you have to do it. I happen to believe we're each on this planet to do something unique. And so I can try to be a second-rate version or someone else, or I can be the very best Beronda that I can be. And so I think paying attention to when you're doing something and you get really excited about it, that thing you would do for free. I would do what I do for free. We will not tell the president and provost this, right? But if I were independently wealthy, this is the thing that I would still want to do every day.
Yeah.
And I do it in a way that's not the way my colleague does it, because I'm me and they're them. And so I think really cultivating and being reflective and staying in touch with yourself about what keeps you motivated, what gets you most excited, and insisting that that's what you have to do with your life. And insisting that when people say, you've contributed to me, well, then I should be able to do this and get paid if it's a contribution to someone. And I think sometimes we talk ourselves out of those things because they look different from anything that anyone else has ever seen. And I think daring to be different, daring to really bring your unique gifts fully to the table is the thing that I encourage people to do.
Yeah, I would totally agree, because I think it's, at least what the personal successes that I found are really when I was doing the thing I wasn't supposed to be doing.
Absolutely.
Right? That thing that everyone keeps telling you that you shouldn't be doing. And that's really where it's at. Like,
I love that. Do either of you have questions for the other?
I could listen to you talk about plants a really long time. You have like my full attention.
I do have a question for him.
Yeah,
I
please.
want to know if I can come and see the tree in bloom.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay.
End of April. Actually, I've got
I needed witnesses.
I've got it down. Third week in April.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, okay.
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
to
Do
see
that.
this. This is like on my bucket list. I have
you-
to see this in person.
Did you show a picture of it?
No, I don't think I
we?
did. I'll put one up, yeah,
Okay.
when we end. Yeah.
Okay. So now I'd like to know if the audience has some questions for our panelists. I'll bring you the microphone.
Hi, that was just extraordinary. Beronda's question about, well, both of your commentaries may be curious, and I speak as an anthropologist who works primarily in Central Africa and African American communities, that about plants and death. And what I mean is that everywhere I've worked, and that's in Japan and Central Africa and in the Amazon, shamans and spirit mediums always emphasize plants as teachers, that the medicinal knowledge that they have of plants, from plants, comes because plants talk to them in dreams and visions and so forth. And it's a very complex statement, but it seems to be tied in with the very curious relationship that plants have with both death and the transcendence of death. So that the process of going into shamanic trance is often compared to death, and it's only when you're in that place of being and non-being that the plants will truly talk to you. In the African American communities that I work in rural Georgia, older women will emphasize that they're going by the trees, that it's the plants that tell, the great trees that tell you where the dead are buried. So that there's something about a willingness to enter into a state of deep loss. This is common in Central and West Africa, where the wood of the plant is the gift of the great tree, which is the home of the ancestors, enters into you when it becomes a mask and wakes up this part of you that's a gift from the ancestors. And I'm just wondering, as an artist and as a scientist, if that relationship between life and its absence and the gifts of plants resonates at all.
Yeah.
It resonates with me deeply because I think that part of our being able to listen to plants and to listen to other organisms is getting out of our conscious state. Because when we're in our conscious state, we are primed to understand things in the language that we know. And I say this all the time, that really understanding the full potential of an organism requires that you understand its language, that you not try to translate its potential in your language. And so that resonates with me because death is a other consciousness, right? It's transitioning from our current consciousness to whatever you believe happens after that. And I think that even in our life, where we're able to get ourselves to almost separate from consciousness, you can start to hear what the other beings in our space are telling us. And every time I say this, I think my mother is really concerned about what happened to me in graduate school. But I truly believe that the other organisms, we can commune with them, but it's our consciousness that blocks us. And so that's why that resonates with me about really the death part of it.
And I think it's sort of the cycle of the plant, right? So it's continuously death and renewal, death and renewal. And I think that becomes an important part. I think on a personal level, my nephew committed suicide a couple years ago, and it just staggered me, right? And it's like, I think I'm still dealing with it. And I think that's where that attempt towards the miraculous that I was talking about, that thing that moves beyond the ordinary, whether it is a tree or putting holes in clouds, becomes really important to me, right? Like, I know I did, or I could have used and can still use a little bit of that sense of wonder.
Hello. Oh. Hi, my name is Troy. I didn't know what talk I would be walking into today. My friend Vern, he actually invited me. He was like, come to the MOCAD. It's a real great talk going on. And I didn't know who would be speaking and what the topic would be on, but then it was on plants. And what was your portion?
I'm putting holes in clouds.
Amazing. I like that. I love that concept. And I didn't have a question until, he presented it. And I'm thinking like, okay, what could I ask? So I was thinking in the sense of plants. Are you familiar with the lotus flower? Okay, because I was thinking about how you were, the connection with humans and plants. Because I practice Nichiren Buddhism, and we believe that the lotus flower represents the simultaneity of cause and effect. Because if people aren't aware, but the lotus flower it's always found in like the murkiest waters, like nasty. It's a very beautiful flower, but it's always found in like the most like dirtiest conditions, and it like represents, or it reflects. It's a reflection of life, how human beings can be in like the most toughest situations, like darkest situations, but you also come out a beautiful person in the end. And I just want to know if you knew that. Okay.
Yeah, so I use a picture of a lotus flower in some talks that I give. I also often use pictures, if you've ever been in volcanoes or places where it looks like nothing should grow, very frequently you'll see a flower there. And so I think plants have so much to teach us about the potential beauty that lies in an individual, independent of the environment that it finds itself in. But yeah, thank you for sharing that, because that's a beautiful example.
That's great.
So I'm curious, now that you all have been talking for a period of time, you sort of got thrown together by this process, didn't know each other. What do you think about that? Has this been a worthwhile experience, like engaging with, this person coming from a different domain that has some connections? Could you give us sort of an insight into the experience of talking to each other and reflecting with each other?
Our first conversation was amazing. It was, because it was. We were sort of brought together really just on the fact that we work with plants. And then for me, it's just been wonderful it's interesting. In a lot of ways, it mirrors my own interests, but then it takes them further, right? And takes it into other directions that I hadn't anticipated or thought of. But the one thing that we really came out of our first conversation was this idea of how natural phenomena, specifically what relates to plants, becomes a metaphor, right, for us individually, but then us as a community. And that's why I still go back to that idea of plants being able to change their environment, which Beronda was talking about.
Yeah, I agree. From our very first conversation, I think I became a fan of his, and I was really impressed by the way he talked about the work he's done with that tree as art, as community building, as conservation, as a symbol for evolution. You know, to think of one project and the many different angles and ways in which you could think about it has really stuck with me. Because I certainly think about my career from different angles, but I thought I'm missing some still. And I have to reflect on more about how many different ways what looks like a single thing can have so many different impacts, outcomes, and different views. So it's just been an amazing process, an amazing opportunity.
Yeah,
I'm honored to know you.
Oh my God. So I actually also have a question for the two of you. One thing I wanted to get both of your guys' opinion on was this idea of obsession. I grew up in a family split between artists and scientists, and that's kind of what was the original impetus for even this idea for a panel discussion in the first place. And one similarity I always saw between both artists and scientists was this ability to obsess over their work, to the point that the normal parameters of Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 is when I do my job, and then, Friday at 5, it's the weekend, and I don't, and that's it. Where both scientists and artists, all of those parameters kind of fall away. And it became, I think the first project I worked on with you, Sam, you found me asleep in a closet at an art fair once because we were working until midnight for multiple nights in a row doing whatever. And so I wanted to kind of ask you how the idea of becoming obsessed with an idea and how that is a motivating factor for your work and how that starts to dissolve that boundary between work and life and your family life or your social idea, and how it all ends up melding and what influence that has on your work and practice.
Well, clearly I'm obsessed with plants, right? I talk about, give plants examples in leadership meetings. But I also, so I'm obsessed with it, but it doesn't take over my whole life. People will tell you I'm very serious about my spa time. There's no plant thinking in there. Only, the scents that come from the plants. But I think you're right in that there are no boundaries. One of my son, one of his first words was, names of plants, and he has relationships with the tree in the yard that we've been watching grow. And so there are these boundaries. There are this kind of blending of boundaries, but I don't think of myself as a scientist first. I think of myself as a thinker, as a speaker, as a writer. And sometimes I do that in the scientific realm, but really I feel like my place is to understand my place in the universe and to share that in ways that are impactful to me and to others. And so in that way, there are no boundaries, because wherever I go, I'm trying to do that, but I'm very clear about not letting science take over my life. But that's just the way I've done it. So no interruptions in my spa time.
I don't know. I've been trying to get better. Because, one of the things I'm prone to obsess about things, right? And too much attention to something isn't a good thing, right? That backing away from it for a while, so trying to get multiple things going, which then just turns into multiple obsessions at the same time that all come together. I don't know. I'm still working on it.
But that's how I broke my obsession. Is I started by scheduling these breaks, and then I reflected on them, and I realized that my best thoughts came after I had had the break.
Yeah.
And so then the break became important to the continuing the work. So I had to collect data on it, right, to do that. But in the end, it worked. I had to obsess about it, but in the end, I realized that it was working, and that when you come out of those periods of reflection or just sitting, for me, it's sitting watching water, you come out of those periods refreshed, and the best, most creative thoughts come when you haven't sat in the obsession so long that you fatigue the muscles that drive your creativity.
Yeah. I think it's like that. It's sort of linked with, I think, science and art. There's sort of this belief in an epiphany, right? And I really think it's more a matter of it creeps up on you, and if you can try to break that obsession a little bit, that's when things start to evolve. But I think it still requires some level of obsession. I'm
Yes.
still working on the equation. That's a terrible answer.
I think related to this earlier answer is I keep thinking about this. I think it was from Renaissance or something. There was that hierarchical ladder of consciousness, human on top, sort of plant on the bottom, right? And there have been like a lot of conversation now, especially in the past few years, where basically the root is the very ending of the root is considered a pretty like a more intelligent than we thought, because it kind of communicates with other roots. It doesn't run into other roots. It's considerate of like the roots of the other trees of other species that are in the ground. So it's a pretty fascinating, right, like on a scale thing. And I was wondering, as I was listening to both of you talk, I was wondering, what is your attitude towards the plant? Is it something that, what is that like religion, or what is this obsession? Is it something, do you see the plant, the plant life is something that like forms, right? Or is it something, there's a mention of the kind of the philosophy of like a plant life that we can learn from to transform the environments we're in. I guess I'm wondering, what is that like? Is it active or passive? Like, what is that like interest in the plant? Is it something that you're trying to learn from as like a human, or is it more of a kind of obsession or like a religion, or?
Yeah.
So,
Oh, go ahead.
I believe strongly in a principle. It's an indigenous principle that I heard from Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's not the originator of it, but in indigenous cultures, they will often say that plants are our oldest teachers. So by basis of experience, they've had a longer experience than we have, so we should listen. And, whether I don't get into the higher or lower, but what I do know is that when I reflect on plants, I have learned things from them. So they're clearly teaching me. In some ways, I think they're smarter than humans. So most plants, when they compete, don't do it like humans. We compete to the death. You have to die, I have to win. Plants compete just enough so that they're in the environment to get just what they need, and then they don't spend any more energy competing with you because they have what they need and you shouldn't get what you need. And so when I think about those kinds of things, I don't know if they're higher or lower, but they've been here for a long time. They stay in environments that we run away from, and they persist. And so I have to believe that there's something I can learn from them. To do otherwise means that I don't live as rich a life for myself. So that's you can call it a religion if you want to, but I don't know who's the preacher in that scenario. Maybe they are, because I'm listening to them and I'm giving them offerings, right? So.
I don't know if it's necessarily a passive or active engagement so much as growing any plant definitely becomes sort of a collaboration, right? Like, you can try to make them do things, but they're going to do what they want, right? So it's not, it's definitely working with it rather than what you would consider another material to work on as an art material. But this week I've really been rethinking things. Scott last night said that he doesn't turn his houseplants because he's afraid that turning it away is going to mess him up. And then I was like, I must be a mass murderer, right? Like, I'm like cutting them and sticking them together. And I'm still working with that today. I don't know where to put that. It did.
My question is, again, relating to these spiritual practices, or the spiritual element of plant and the different practices that have this connection to the earth. It's throughout all religions. Currently, I'm in Vedic studies, so that's very intimately related with Buddhism and that tradition. But here and now in the United States and in our urban environment and in this new food system, organic food movement is showing us that yes, this food is indeed our teacher, and I believe that consumption of these plants is the most intimate way that these plants convey information to us, in the way that we structure our bodies based off of what we have. So that being said, with a spiritual practice, when you add that consciousness of intaking proper organic foods to build your body up, to support your mind, to support your spirit, soul, that's a game changer discussion in terms of healing our communities. In particular, I'm interested in like the marketing and the messaging aspect of this, particularly in urban communities of color. And I'm wondering if you have any takeaways as far as organic food, what we could do to better get the message through to those communities.
I think, well, one of the things is that that I've noticed. So I grow these heirloom trees, right? And so people are like, well, I mean, I see them all the time at my farmer's market, right? And you're like, oh no, like. So it turns out, and I started doing research through the USDA on this, and I think in terms of a marketing message, sometimes we start to feel like we're doing enough, and it's not even putting a dent in it. Farmers markets account for 0.3% of all agricultural sales. Organics are only 6% of all sales in the US in terms of food. And so I know that in terms of, like, you have different dynamics in different cities, right? And so a lot of them aren't paying attention to that issue of just growing things without dumping pesticides on them, right? And I don't know how you get people, I try to get people excited, right? And a lot of it for me is just going back and like finding those things within its history that become relevant, right? So I have like this one plum that I grow that I'm like, oh, this was like grown by Romans. So like you can taste something that was tasted 2,000 years ago. And like those sorts of, those cultural tie-ins, and perhaps it's even those spiritual tie-ins that you're talking about. When they become more relevant to people, then they become more valuable.
I think one of the I don't know that it's marketing, but I think one of the ways that I've done a lot of gardening with youth of late. And one of the things we've tried to do in terms of the organic and all of that is to do gardens based off of practices like the Three Sisters Garden, which is a Native American practice where you plant plants together that grow better together without any pesticides or fertilizer than if you grow them in monoculture. And so those kinds of things can help people to start to see the relationship between plants and how organically you can support growth and also have lessons for community. And so we've tried to tie it to lessons to community as the marketing ploy, even as they're learning things about the food itself and organic versus pesticide or fertilizer-induced growth. And so a lot of the times we've tried to make it a holistic process that is about the food and community as opposed to just focusing on organic versus non-organic. And that's been really helpful because people get drawn into the story intrinsically by itself, and then you hit them with the message you really want to give them later.
Last month during Mules in the Market, I went to a panel, and on the panel was a butcher, a farmer, and a restaurateur. And the conversation was about food and the disconnect between, you know, the food that we eat, like in the urban environments, you know, that consume them. And like this conversation has like made me direct that conversation that we had during that panel to plants. I grew up in like 3 different environments in relation to plants. In Detroit, I was on 7 Mile and Hoover. It's concrete, like you don't see much besides grass. My parents are both from Haiti. So in the 4th grade, I went to Haiti for the first time. And all of a sudden, it's all these plants and trees that I've never seen before. And you like grow with respect for them, and now it's suddenly something different. And then when I was, in college, I went to Ann Arbor, and that's just another place that's like surrounded in green. So how, like, you guys are two people that are clearly passionate about plants, clearly because you've been exposed to them, but to those, like, same thing with this organic and, not organic conversation, how does one that is in an urban environment get exposed to plants otherwise, like that they wouldn't be exposed to? Like, how do you open that conversation to a kid or to a student?
I think the beautiful part about plants is that you can grow them anywhere, and even in these urban environments where there are lots of concrete, you can do container gardens, right? There's a lot of focus on urban gardens, and so I think just bringing plants into that environment in whichever way you can, whether it's through container gardens or other ways, it gets around this concept of plant blindness. Many of us are surrounded by plants and aren't paying attention to them. But I think that that's the beauty of plants, is that they're very flexible. And if you're not in a place where there's lots of soil, you can still do container gardens, which allows people to be engaged with those.
That's funny. That's where the trees started for me, because I was growing them all in containers.
In containers?
Hundreds and hundreds of trees in containers I did that for a few years when I first started. And yeah, it was just as simple as like buying containers at Home Depot and soil there and just seeing what happens. And actually what preceded the Tree of 40 Fruit was I actually did a garden that was all grafted together, right? So grafting like peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers, watermelon, so it was one continuous plant. But that was really easy. That was all concrete. That was done in a cinder block studio, right? Yeah, so those things are, and it's interesting because before I started growing trees, I really didn't have much engagement with kids, right? I was always like, I was like, I'm a New York artist, right? I'm like, but I mean, kids are where it changes, right? And so getting involved at that level, I think, is really important, right? And going to school groups and trying to get them engaged in things, that's really where the change happens, because that time that you spend with them, like teaching them how to grow, and my God, if you get like a vegetable or a fruit out of the deal too, and they eat it, it's all over, right? They're going to be doing that the rest of their lives.
So before we get to a final close here, I want to draw your attention. I mentioned that we're going to be doing a show in the summer of 2018 called Hustle. We've just issued our open call for works, so any of you who make art or objects, I see some of you in the audience who do this sort of thing. I'd like to encourage you to come and grab one of these flyers from my colleague Caroline, who's here at the bar. If you have friends who are artists or makers or scientists who are interested in these kinds of subjects, please let them know. We are accepting applications from people all over the world. So thank you for that. And also, thank you very much for being here at this really special night for us. Let's give a warm round of applause to Sam and Beronda, who were incredible.